Getting started? Okay, I first off want to thank you all for your attention. That's what this presentation is all about attention. And in contrast with the previous presentations, which have been in nature a little bit more technical, this one is somewhat more ethical. And it's that by nature because I am I'm a psych undergrad, and I'm also double majoring in philosophy, and I have a lot of interest in ethics in light of all of these digital experiences that are emerging. It's kind of interesting to see where are we going to point our ethical barometer as we engage in these experiences. So to begin, this presentation is going to be divided in two parts. The first part, we're going to talk about vision and cognition, and the second part is going to be focused on memory processing to see how exactly is that memory works in our brain from a very general conception. And then I'm going to juxtapose these two elements with the ethical imperative, which is the hijacking of attention. I'm going to get a little bit more into detail. But if there's something that I'd like for you to remember in this presentation is that red dot. You can forget everything I'll say in 20 minutes, but please just don't forget to guard your attention. That's what this presentation is about. So again, you forget everything I said, just don't forget that. So let's get started. Let's talk about vision and cognition, and this is kind of like what I like to call the mind's gatekeeper. And I say this because the human eye is really the marvel. It's the crown jewel of all of our sensory organs, right? It's basically the first front door of cognition is how we perceive reality. Now, there's a caveat with this because nothing enters our stream of consciousness that isn't first structured and modified and organized and edited to by our nervous system, right? So as what we see is our perception of reality, it's far from it, right? For example, if you can think of eagles. Sorry. There you go. Okay, if you think of the eye of an eagle, what we might see at maybe 2 kilometers or miles away, the eagle can actually see it in 4K image resolution, right? If it's hunting for a rabbit, it can see that, right? So the world is dominated in this case by the distance, unlike us, as it's more in line of sight. And so our visual system is optimized, but still narrow, right? If we think of snakes, for example, or most reptiles, they don't really see color. They instead see heat, right? And so snakes can detect infrared heat signatures, and this is light, obviously, that we don't see at all. And so this perception reveals an entire parallel reality that is working in tandem with our reality, right? And if you think of mantis shrimp, they don't just see color, right? They see structures of color inside color, right? We have 3 specialized cells in our neural retina, and that's 3, but this guy has somewhere around 12 to 16. So this little insect can see colors that we will never be able to see. It'll be virtually impossible biologically speaking, right? So what am I trying to say is that if our reality starts with what we see, then so must our understanding. Because virtually 50% of our cerebral cortex is involved in visual processing. Right? This means that it imposes the highest metabolic demand for really anything we do. We can close our eyes right now, and we could still be imagining images, visually speaking, because our brain is so involved in processing what we see. And so, in a nutshell, our perception is equal to our selection. So, what are we selecting to? So real quick, I'm just going to talk a little bit about neural anatomy and how our visual field is projected. We have a full visual field, but it's actually being converged by the input of 2 eyes, and it's being decussated, right? So, in other words, our left eye is seeing the left part with a little bit of the right part, and so on and so forth with our right eye. So if you think of it from our viewpoint as like eye level, this is kind of the distribution where most of our focus is paracentral or central, right? And here's kind of like a more realistic way of imagining how our eyes are darting. We see things in focus, but around us, it might get a little blurry, right? Now, I'd like to bring in a little piece of wisdom that's 2,000 years old. Epictetus, it has been said, Epictetus said this, you become what you give your attention to. And with this thought, I'd like to pass on to our next section, which is what I like to call the mind's treasure. And we're going to talk about memory processing. So here's a simplified model. It starts over here with our sensory stimulus. So this, we could call this our visual field. And whenever we see something or hear something or feel something, that's kind of a stimulus. In this context, we're going to talk about visual stimulus. So as we mentioned, our attention is that sort of like focused diameter within our visual field. And as our neural retina receives this input, it passes on to the first layer of what we call memory processing, which is our sensory memory. Now this is everything where it's raw and unfiltered, and it lasts anywhere between 100 to 500 milliseconds, give or take, right? And the interesting thing is that we can only handle about the 7 to 9 items, right? So our brain, of course, is optimized to ensure that whatever it needs its attention, it is being selected, right? And if something holds our attention, then we pass on to the next section, which is our working memory. Sustained attention in the working memory is about 1 minute, give or take, right? So if we sustain our attention for 1 minute on something, like you guys hopefully are doing with this slide, it'll pass on to the next section. Now this is a bifurcation, right? We are either going to rehearse it or we're going to forget it, right? If we forget it, it's likely because it's not interesting enough for us. Our attention goes somewhere else. But if we are interested enough, we'll probably rehearse it over and over and over again, because the end goal really is to treasure this memory, right? The mind's treasure is long-term memory. This is where things can be stored for decades. Sometimes you'll go back to that childhood street you grew up in, and you suddenly begin to remember all these things that happened to you when you were 5 or 6, right? So that's actually your long-term memory working and retrieving this information. But it takes a while to get there, and the process to get there is what I've learned is called encoding. So if this is our end goal, how is it exactly that we get there? And more importantly, what is already getting there without our explicit consent or our sustained voluntary attention? So this brings us to our next section, which is part 2. This is a moral imperative that I was talking about. And this is titled Bypassing the Gatekeeper. Now, just to give a quick overview of what we have been talking about in context with digital interfaces. First, we start off with what we see, right? And it is typically, often that we engage in our computers and our phones, and in our visual field, whatever it is that we're looking at in our computers or in our phones, we have a sustained aspect of attention, right? But if you can think, for example, to illustrate of social media, these digital interfaces are architectured in a way to deploy the attributes of the very nature of how our brain works to store memory, right? If you remember, how many items could we have in our explicit memory or sensory memory? Yeah, 7 to 9, right? Now, if you can think, how many tiles can you see in your Explore page on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or YouTube? It's not 25, if you're wondering, right? And that's by design, right? So if something catches our mind, something catches our attention, it's usually here where it's hijacked, right? We create extreme, appealing thumbnails that immediately catch our attention, sometimes done by either outrage or clickbait or whatever it might be, right? This is actually where it's typically designed or engineered to be bypassed. And if it sustains our attention, it passes on to our working memory. Now there's an interesting caveat here. Perhaps you might have seen that in most of the vertical shaped UI interfaces of social media, they have like this little thing here. This is what I like to call attention hooks, right? So sometimes you kind of see things and you're like, oh, this is cool, and your thumb is right there, right? And you can either like it or comment on it. If they did something wrong, you're immediately going to jump on that to correct them. You might save it, or you might even share it, right? So what this is doing is kind of like giving you cues to rehearse and encode whatever it is that you're paying attention to. And in this case, I'm arguing that what you're paying attention isn't exactly what is in your screen. It's actually a behavior that is being engineered by thousands of people, by very, very intelligent people to be able to finally sell you whatever it is that they want to offer you, right? And so if the long term is to get into your long-term memory, well, we have to, again, rehearse and encode this. We have to repeat it over and over again. And so when you're in a digital interface, you're basically seeing a stream of things that are being presented to you, and they're being carefully curated basically on all the data that is being gathered as to how is it that you use these digital interfaces, right? And of course, as we have our attentional hooks, we may even be sharing stuff to our friends. Oh man, this is so good, I can't even help but to keep it to myself. I'll go ahead and share it to my friend. That's what you're doing, and you might even be receiving things, right? And so this is a model, and I guess it begs the question, is it just you? Yeah, right? It feels like it's just you, right? Because you have it in your phone, and your phone is a military-grade privacy machine that no one can access. But the reality is that it might not just be you. Because again, you're engaged in this experience, but other people are also receiving everything that we are sharing to each other, right? And I can only show about 8 of these models, 8 of these heads, but it just keeps going and going and going to the point where, you know, it's just endless, right? And I have some figures that I'd like to share with you, but hopefully this can make the point clear that while it feels private, unfortunately, it's far from it. So there are over 5.4 billion social media users globally. This is from this year. If you had access to 2/3 of the world population, to what they're interested in, right? What they're looking at, honestly, would you be curious to kind of know? Yeah. I think it's human to say yes, right? And this is where the ethical imperative is most important. Will we use it for the user or against them? I don't have the answer to that question. I think each of us are required to look within. But this is something that has interested me for a while, and I began to experiment. I used to be a video editor. I spent a lot of time, preparing content before the advent of AI, and I developed perhaps what we could say like some formulas, a hypothesis, where you can actually increase the engagement of people by following these formulas. If you have curiosity, you times it by controversy, you can hold them captive, right? Here's another one. If you have outrage and you add some ambiguity, you cut the video right in the sweet spot where they're like, wait, what happened? Then you have their attention. And it can be squared, right? You can keep going with their attention over and over again, right? So my hypothesis looks something like this. If you have controversy and you times it with an emotional element and you divide it with low accuracy, so it's very misleading, it's surprising that you'll get very high engagement, right? And so I tested it. I made a YouTube channel, and I created some videos following this formula. The first one got 300,000 views. The second one failed the hypothesis. I switched some variables there. But the third one got almost 8 million views. Wow. Right? So this is how the algorithm sees us. But how is it that we are seen without the device. I'd like you to pay attention to the following pictures here. The photographer has removed or photoshopped out the cellular device. And just see what thoughts these images might detonate in your mind. Okay, we have a couple. We have a loving family engaged and we would like to say each other, right? But here's one of my favorites. But this is a couple preparing to go to sleep, right? You don't want to see too much blue light before you go to bed. But they seem kind of hooked on something, whatever it is that they're seeing. And it feels just so intimate there, so private. It feels such a profound connection between these two, right? But here's the thing. This is Reed Hastings. He's the CEO of Netflix. Notice what he said in connection with the last picture that we saw. He said, we're competing with sleep. This is from The Independent. You could look up the quote so it's not taking that out of context. But just think of this. Our biological needs have now become rivals to our own cognition. In other words, humans are now both the consumers and the consumed. So, I'm with a bunch of computer science engineers, and I have a question for you. How can AI be used to improve this clearly concerning situation? Here's another one. What conditions allow AI to enhance and not erode this aspect of human life? And if it's not obvious to you, what I'm talking about is human-to-human connection. Right? The pictures that we saw are the antisocial part of social media. Well, these questions, honestly, I don't know, but it's pretty clear that attention is a form of currency, isn't it? So, to conclude, all I have for you is to guard your attention. Thank you.